In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the political economy of trade and trade policy, particularly, where does protectionism come from? Now, this is all going to be based on the theory of comparative advantage, and that's kind of the standard theory of trade. I'm going to go strictly with the Ricardian view. There is another model, the Heckscher-Ohlin model, that is also used, but I'm going to keep it simple and just talk about the Ricardian comparative advantage theory, and based off of that, give you what is very often the standard view of trade that economists and political economists have, but especially economists when they dabble in political economy, this is kind of their standard view. So the theory of comparative advantage, overall, it says that trade makes both nations better off as a whole. And there's a lot of effort amongst economists to talk about this and to say, okay, look, comparative advantage, it makes both parties better off because they're able to produce a quantity of goods together that they could not produce separately. And that means there's, same amount of resources, more stuff being made in the world. That is what economists think of as good, right? And they call it efficiency, but it's, basically making more with what you've got. And that's, what we want to try to do whenever possible, right? So the thing about comparative advantage is it produces specialization. And this is the prediction that when you have trade, nations will specialize in the good in which they have a comparative advantage, right? And so this is the big explanation. So what you're going to have as a result in countries where trade is allowed, but where there's a lot of trade with other nations, you're going to have a sector, and a sector is a group of industries, and an industry is essentially a group of companies making the same product, right? So a sector, though, is a group of industries that have a similar aspect to them. And in this case, we're going to differentiate between the export-oriented sector, which are, that's where the comparative advantage for that nation lies. And those are going to be the companies that are producing not just for domestic consumption, but also to export for trade. And then there's the import competing sector. And that's the sector where you have the companies that, don't make products that are in the other nation's comparative advantage, not that nation. And they are going to be competing with the imports from other nations. And that sector, in a model, it goes away completely. There's perfect specialization. In reality, we know that if you free up trade, you're already starting out. You're already making this stuff for yourself. So, that sector will shrink. And it may not go away completely because you may have some people who have assets that can only be used to produce that product, and they're just going to suck it up and have to compete with the imports. Now, economists focus very much on the costs and benefits, right? And it's very important to understand the benefits of trade liberalization, of free trade, are primarily accrue to consumers, right? The benefit of a trade agreement of foreign trade is cheap foreign imports. That's what I say. Foreign imports, based on the theory of comparative advantage, are cheaper because of the specialization, right? You are trading something that is very hard for that other folks to make, or they have greater opportunity costs. They might be able to make it, but it's relatively easier for them to produce the good they're exporting to you. They have lower opportunity costs in producing it. And so it's just efficient to trade these goods back and forth. And so they come in to your market cheaper than what you would produce, right? That's a big thing. And so I always like to say, look, that's the point of foreign imports. They are cheaper. We're able to consume more, right? We don't benefit from trade with higher wages. We benefit through higher real wages. That is to say, they're able to buy more, right? And that is the result of cheap foreign imports. So And I'm kind of turning that on its head. But the consumers are the ones that benefit. This is the big thing in the story economists tell and the story of comparative advantage. The other beneficiaries, of course, are the export competing producers. They are now producing for the world, and it's a, that sector definitely grows. The cost of this, though, is there, even though as a whole the nation benefits, there are costs associated. Import competing producers, folks that cannot get out of that sector into the export-oriented sector, whether as, and producers, by producers, I mean both the companies, the executives, the stockholders, owners of factories, owners of farms, whatever, owners of productive resources, also workers, right? Because workers own productive resources. They own themselves, their skills, and their experience. All of that is folded into producers. So the key thing here is, if you are mobile, right? If capital or labor is mobile, it can shift out of one sector into another. If you're immobile, you're stuck. If you're immobile in the export competing producer sector, you're okay. If you're immobile in the import competing sector, you're hurt by this, right? So in this view, in the model, no one gets hurt, right? In the real world, import competing producers are hurt. Now, the Ricardo-Wiener hypothesis, right, often referred to as the sector-specific model. It's the only one we're going to look. There's another one that deals with factor analysis, that looks at factors of production and how they work. We're going to just keep with the sector one. The Ricardo-Wiener hypothesis says people in import competing sectors will demand protection. As I was just explaining, mobility between sectors is key. And they see, this produces vertical divisions and interests. And that is to say that we see industries competing, or people in the industries demanding protection. So whether or not you're a worker or a manager or the owner of capital, you all will coalesce, fight together to save your company, to save your industry, right? And it creates that kind of differentiation. In the other model, factor specific, you can get a horizontal division, but we're not going to talk about that too much. Okay, the political imbalance, and the key thing is, look, everyone in the society is a consumer, so everyone's benefiting at some level, and it's just a few people who are actually in this import competing sector that are hurt. So why is trade liberalization not a wildly popular thing? Because why? And this is the fundamental question economists had, right? Everything they study tells them trade makes nations better off. Yet we have this pesky protectionism popping up. And Mankar Olson, he provided, amongst others, this is actually at a level where just all economists, this is the standard argument these guys make. And you can find Milton Friedman talking about it and all, but Mankar Olson kind of laid it out. And so we'll use him as the citation, that there is a political imbalance between gainers and losers in the story, right? And that the gainers have a political advantage based on the way costs are distributed versus benefits, based on their inherent organization within their sectors, based on them having superior information by virtue of being producers, and in some cases are electoral factors that will favor one industry over another. And I'm going to discuss each of these in turn. Distributional factors is what economists tend to focus on the most, right? And there's this idea that people, if people will favor things that materially benefit them, right? So if you're going to increase my wealth, I'm going to be in favor of it, right? Which is pretty, this is basic pocketbook politics. It's also, I'll just tell you right off the bat, overly simplistic, right? And so economists think that this is the primary motivation. For most voters, it is not. However, let's go through this. Distributional factors. they argue the big problem we have with trade is that the benefits to consumers are diffused rather, and that everyone in the society benefits a little bit from trade liberalization. However, the costs to the import competing producers are highly concentrated. You're losing our job. I'm losing my factory or my farm. I can't sell the products I used to sell, right? And so people's way of life is disappearing, that kind of thing. So huge, apocalyptic costs to some import competing producers. And therefore you're setting, and this is like the knee-jerk explanation of economists, that the benefits to consumers are diffused, so it's just a little bit, and it doesn't really motivate them to act much. The cost to the import competing producers are highly concentrated, and so they are in a fight for their life, and they just fight harder. The consumers, maybe not even at all. The one thing is that the export competing producers are around. Their benefits are concentrated, but they're not essential. I mean, yes, we're going to grow our business, but we're not threatened with destruction, right? So these guys are maybe not as motivated, although very often the export competing producers are important lobbyists for trade liberalization. It does turn out that sometimes is the case. But okay, the distributional factors are key. Now, I said that not everyone goes off of that. There's something called sociotropic views, right? And which is a terrible word, I understand, but a lot of people they do look at distribution. They do look at costs and benefits, but they don't look at it for themselves. They look at it and they say, is this good for the economy, right? And so a lot of voters, a lot of people are out there who do that. And in fact, one thing we find is that, that is for a lot of people, because most people don't feel they have a dog in the fight, right, of trade. They will tend to talk about, is this good for the economy? And the question is, you would think that would make them even more likely to vote for this, but that is something that economists are kind of missing. It's called sociotropic. It's not, hey, am I personally better off? It's like, do I think the society is better off? And a lot of voting, actually, believe it or not, goes along that. The people are not narrowly self-interested, a lot of times because they can't determine what their self-interest is in any given case. And a lot of times they're asked to vote on issues that affect other people, right? And so they naturally say, well, all right, well, it doesn't affect me, but what's good for the society, right? And there's a surprising amount of that out there, actually. Okay, so moving on. Informational factors. Import competing producers have lots of information, right? It's their job, it's their industry. And so they have lots of information, and given the costs that are involved, they have an incentive to avoid those costs, right? So they can spend money and they will spend money on, on information and collecting it, or make efforts at least to stay aware on the topic, right? Consumers are relatively uninformed, and they have very little, since the benefits to them are small. And also think about, consumers have so many things, so many different products they buy, right? You got one job. Consumers buy many products. And so how could they possibly be informed about all the products they buy and how the price might change on those products if there was a little trade liberalization? Export competing producers, they are not as well informed about someone else's industry, but they are probably more informed, and they have a moderate incentive to keep their pulse on the political activity out there. And so, and we don't want to edge over into organizational issues, right? That's going to come up, but they are probably better informed than consumers, not as well informed as import competing producers. So import competing producers, when it comes time to organize, are probably better informed and have an incentive to stay informed, and are going to know about potential legislation, they're going to have information at their hands to lobby against it, and they're just going to be more aware of the topic. Organizational factors, and this is another thing that goes with the informational. Producers are organized, right? The producers, like I say, labor is part of it, but when you think of labor and management, producers, the management of industries, industries tend to form organizations to represent their interests for exactly this kind of thing. But there are other reasons, and so even if it hasn't been trade liberalization on the table before, they probably have an organization that has already been established, and they have a network, right? And so they're organized. Um, Labor, very often you have unions out there, and if you don't have unions, well, very often workers are just already there. It's not hard to find them, even if they go to work in the same place, and even if you don't work in the same place, company-wide email, right? There's already a mechanism to talk to one another, right? And so you're already organized there. And companies have, this is one reason they've started making pacts. They tend to, the company will often do the work of getting people organized, if not into unions, certainly into pacts to represent their collective interests. Because in this, management and labor are on the same side. And so we have company organized pacts. Consumers, there are consumer organizations. I mean, but everyone's a consumer, so no one is. I mean, it's we're all consumers at some level, but we consume so many different products, and so how am I to get together with other peanut consumers, right, or peanut butter consumers, or you tend to not be organized in any particular way, and there is now you can create networks. And social media does allow networks of some products, you can go viral and you can connect up with people. And that's a huge change, right? But it has to be done. It's not, so there's definitely an organizational advantage for producers. The final thing is sometimes industries will be favored in terms of the electoral factors. And basically, when we have, there are two types of electoral systems out there. One is the district-based system that we have in the United States, where you have a geographic district and one person is elected to the legislature or the Senate or whatever you're voting on. You have one person going there. The other kind is proportional representation. A lot of European countries have this, where you go out and you vote for a party, and if the party gets 15% of the vote, they get 15% of the seats in the legislature, right? And which type of system you have has an impact on what type of protectionism or what pattern of protectionism arises in the country. In the district-based system, right, we have representatives. One of the things I like to point out, representatives are immobile. If you represent a district in a rural area that maybe had a mill, right, a textile mill, and that was the case in a lot of large parts of North Carolina. If and certainly in North Carolina, we had a lot of textile mills. We also have Charlotte, right, where the banking industry grew, right, and that you could argue that that's kind of like what happens, right? We have a change in the economy, and the thing is, even though you could say, hey, look, the economy is changing, it's no big deal, the banking industry is growing, textile mills are shrinking, banking industry is growing, so it's all good. Well, and it might be, right, from the point of view of the country. However, from the point of view of the representative of the district of the textile mill, it's all bad because the representatives are immobile, right? No representative represents the entire country except the president, right? So the pluses of trade are very often irrelevant to them. I mean, they might like it if you've got a Caterpillar factory in your district or a Boeing plant, right? You're great, you're on the plus side of things. But are you recognizing that trade liberalization is part of that, right? again, there's a huge, the immobility factor really comes into play. Also, critical districts, right? Uh, in critical districts, well, what are critical districts? Those are districts that are fairly evenly divided between the parties, right? And by the way, anytime you have a district system, you will have two political parties, right? That is Duverger's law, right? There's actually a law in political science that district-based systems produce a two-party system. Proportional representation produces multiple parties, right? There will be many more than two. So in this case, in a critical district, you have a fairly even matchup. The races are competitive. Those are the industries that will get more protection as a rule, because both parties will be competing for it, and both parties will want to go on the record as supporting protection for whatever industries are in that district. In a pure Democratic or Republican district, meh, it's not so important. And the key thing, by the way, is both parties will offer protection because they'll both be trying to get voters in that district, right? In a proportional representation system, I mentioned there's a lot of parties out there, and there the key thing is there aren't central districts. There will be support for growing industries. I mean, there's a benefit to the growing industries because the interests of legislators are not tied to one district. And so in a proportional representation system, the key thing is how big is the industry? How many workers are there in that industry as a whole? Because those are the voters, and those are the industries, that get it. So in a district-based system, industries that are concentrated in critical districts will get the protection. In proportional representation systems, the larger industry will get protection. Does that make a little sense? And you do see, you'll see companies frequently will make choices about where they put factories and how they distribute their production with an eye, to districts and where things are, that. Whereas in a PR system, proportional representation system is just, they don't worry about that. It's just a question of, hey, how big? The big industries get protection. Okay, here's an example that is often used to demonstrate this. Did you know that the United States pays twice the world average for sugar, right? And one reason that we have Mexican Coke out there and people will buy it is in Mexico, they pay a lot less for sugar, right? Because we protect the sugar industry in the United States. And so Mexican Coke has cane sugar in it, whereas regular Coke frequently has, corn syrup, and high fructose corn syrup gets used. Other sweeteners get used, and we've been seeing that. The U.S. We have a sugar industry. There are small cane factories, in Hawaii and Florida, but also throughout the Midwest, there's sugar beets, right? And sugar beets produce sugar, even though it's not cane sugar, it's sugar, right? And it's part of that. And so also the high fructose corn syrup has, as the price of sugar was raised, alternatives to sugar are being used. So people that make corn are benefiting from this. So the point is, we have really high prices in comparison to the rest of the world. We have we pay about twice the world, right? And so the thing is, and just to explain, what we have is a tariff rate quota, right? And basically we have a quota that will let so much in, and so the tariff is 0.66 cents a pound, trivial, up to the quota. Once the quota's hit, the tariff rate goes to 15 cents per pound, right? So that's huge. So the world price, and this is old data. At one point, just to give you an idea, the U.S. price was 35, the world price was 19, right? So not quite, it's close to twice, right? And that's old, I forget what the date, but if you look it up, were always bigger. And again, based on, and this is old information, but costs were about 1.8 billion to consumers. Wow, that's a lot of money. Here's the thing. The cost to the individual was about $6 a year, right? That's why I'm not worried about updating this. This is, in this example, this is not pathetic. This is a year. It's about 10, 15 years ago. The cost to the individual is $6. Now think about that. $6 on everything you consume all year long that uses sugar, right? Wow. That's pennies on a bag, even though the wholesale price is twice as much, a bag of sugar doesn't cost twice as much, right? Because there's a lot of other fixed costs to producing it and distributing it and that sort of thing. So there's, and certainly on the foods you buy, the soda you buy, it's pennies. It's pennies. And if the sugar quotas went away, yes, we would as a country pay a lot less for sugar. However, would you notice it? Right? It certainly is not it wouldn't be a life-changing thing, right? Whereas if you lose your job, it is life-changing. And so the example, this is often used as an example to say, look, here's this thing. We've got this quota. It is protecting industries. And these industries are organized in a way, they tend to be rural and they tend to be, I don't know if it's the best example of an industry concentrated in critical districts, especially the sugar beet and corn stuff but they used to be more critical. Certainly Florida is on, is a beneficiary here and they're critical, but it's often used as this example of diffuse benefits and concentrated costs. The cost to consumer, or the benefit to it here, would be the savings if we liberalized, if we got rid of it. And this quota has survived many attempts to get it pushed back, and I have not heard of it being wiped out since this time. I keep waiting for the day that this slide will be entirely historical, and it hasn't necessarily come around. So the key thing, though, the people who are lobbying to get rid of the sugar quota are the food processors. People who use sugar in making food are the ones that tend to lobby. And that historically has been the case, that there are often industries or firms that will lobby for, if they are, they're the ones that have to end up fighting for it because the consumers won't. However, they haven't won, right? Or the sugar quotas have stayed around forever, it seems. So this is the typical example of what we're talking about in all the other things, right? And like I say, for you as a consumer, if you could save $6, right? I mean, what would it cost to, I've just told you about this. You may never have heard of it, right? How do you come informed, and what's the cost of getting informed, right? And then forget think about it. If you value your time, how long would it take you to do a search? What would the cost be to a search for information on this topic? A couple bucks, maybe? That'd be what it's worth to you. And then, how much is left over? If you think of the potential savings as your budget to become informed and take action over this issue. Well, $6 a year is not going to motivate you very much. And, and so you're not going to really, you might say, oh, this is horrible, but meh, I mean, what are you going to do? So it's a great example of the lack of incentive for consumers to really worry about this kind of thing. And it shows kind of the imbalance in political power. So I hope this presentation has been helpful. Sorry it went on for 30 minutes, but a lot of ground to cover here.